Mr. Speaker, humanitarian and development assistance that we had previously committed to Afghanistan this year. With new funding, wait for it, Mr. Speaker, taking this up to £286 million with immediate effect. And we call on others, £286 million with immediate effect, and we call on others to work together on a shared humanitarian effort, focusing on helping the most vulnerable in what will be formidably difficult circumstances. And I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister, and he's been very generous with his time. Over the past 20 years, there have been some 50 NATO and partner nations that have been involved in Afghanistan. I welcome the measures that have been proposed by the UK and other countries such as the US, Canada, France, Germany, and so on. However, there are many countries still who have been involved in Afghanistan in recent years who have still yet to come to the plate and to recognise their responsibility in helping these people at this desperate time. Would the Prime Minister inform the House what is being done to encourage these other countries to take up their responsibility and help these people in Afghanistan?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, Mr. Speaker, and that's why the UK has chaired the Security Council of the UN and asked to put a motion together with our French friends to get the world to focus on the humanitarian needs of Afghanistan. We'll be doing the same thing in NATO, in the G7 and the other bodies in which we have.
You're listening to LBC. Tom Swarbrick in for James O'Brien this morning, listening to the Prime Minister in the House of Commons answering questions about what it is the UK is now going to do given the troop withdrawal, talking about £286 million going into Afghanistan with immediate effect. Back live to the House of Commons.
Quite a lot already this morning, and I know that thanks to the generosity of yourself, Mr. Speaker, and the House, there is now ample time for debate until later on this afternoon. I think many members will be able to get across. I therefore intend, Mr. Speaker, to focus on the region itself. We will also create safe and legal routes for those Afghans most in need to come and settle here. Afghans with whom we've worked directly. I can announce today that we're committing to relocating another 5,000 Afghans this year with a new and bespoke resettlement scheme focusing on the most vulnerable, particularly women and children. And we will keep review for future years with the potential of accommodating up to 20,000 over the long term. And so, taken together, Mr. Speaker, I've been very generous with my intervention, and I think you will agree already, and I've made my position clear. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, we are committing almost £500 million of humanitarian funding to support the Afghan people. Fifth, Mr. Speaker, we must also face the reality of a change of regime in Afghanistan. And as President of the G7, the UK will work to unite the international community behind a clear plan for dealing with this regime in a unified and concerted way. Over the last 3 days, I've spoken with the NATO and UN Secretary General, with President Biden, with Chancellor Merkel, with President Macron, and Prime Minister Khan. We are clear, and we have agreed that it would be a mistake for any country to recognise any new regime in Kabul prematurely or bilaterally. Instead, those countries that care about Afghanistan's future should work towards common conditions about the conduct of the new regime before deciding, together, whether to recognise it and on what terms. We will judge this regime based on the choices it makes and by its actions rather than by its words. On its attitude to terrorism, to crime and narcotics, as well as humanitarian access and the rights of girls to receive an education. Defending human rights will remain of the highest priority, and we will use every available political and diplomatic means to ensure that those human rights remain at the top of the international agenda. Mr. Speaker, our United Kingdom has a roll call of honour that bears the names of 457 servicemen and women who who gave their lives in some of the world's harshest terrain, and many others who bear injuries to this day, fighting in what had become the epicenter of global terrorism. And even amid the heart-wrenching scenes we see today, I believe they should be proud of their achievements. And we should be deeply proud of them, because they conferred benefits that are lasting and ineradicable on millions of people in one of the poorest countries on earth. And they provided vital protection for 2 decades to this country and the rest of the world. They gave their all for our safety, and we owe it to them to give our all to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. Because no matter how grim the lessons of the past, the future is not yet written. And at this bleak turning point, we must help the people of Afghanistan to choose the best of all their possible futures. And in the UN, the G7, in NATO, with friends and partners around the world, that is the critical task on which this government is now urgently engaged and will be engaged in the days to come.
The Prime Minister concluding his opening address in the House of Commons, a difficult session, I think it's fair to say, for the Prime Minister, with questions, some of the questions that were asked of him being studiously avoided, but laying out nonetheless what it is the British government is going to do in the coming days and weeks to help those Afghans now at risk. Let's go back to the House of Commons. You can hear the tones there of the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer.
Before I get to the urgent issue at hand, let me join you, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister in condemning the appalling shootings in Plymouth last week. We all send our condolences to the bereaved families. We must resolve to ensure that firearms do not get into the hands of dangerous people, and finally to get to grips with the way that hate thrives on the internet. Turning to Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, it's been a disastrous week, an unfolding tragedy. 20 years ago, the Taliban were largely in control of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda were using the country as a training ground and a base for terror, including plotting the horrific 9/11 attack. There were widespread human rights abuses. Girls were denied an education. Women couldn't work. Being gay was punishable by death. All imposed without democracy. Since then, a fragile democracy emerged. Mr. Speaker, it was by no means perfect. But no international terrorist attacks have been mounted from Afghanistan in that period. Women have gained liberty and one office. Schools and clinics have been built, and Afghans have allowed themselves to dream of a better future. Mr. Speaker, those achievements were born of sacrifice. Sacrifice by the Afghan people who bravely fought alongside their NATO allies, and British sacrifice. Over 150,000 UK personnel have served in Afghanistan, including members across this House, including the honourable and gallant members for Tunbridge and Morley, for Barnsley Central, Plymouth Moorview, Norwich South, Aldershot, the Isle of Wight, Filton and Bradley Stoke, and Wells. They and the tens of thousands of others deployed in Afghanistan served in difficult and challenging circumstances. And the Labour Party, and I'm sure everybody across this House, thanks each and every one of them, of the 150,000. Many returned with life-changing injuries. And tragically, 457 didn't return at all. I'll just make progress and then I will.
Later today, I'll be attending the service at RAF Lyman, outside Royal Bassett, to commemorate the 10th anniversary, which falls today, of the last repatriation through Bad Bassett. Will the right honourable agree with me that the message to those people I will see today must be not that these young lives were wasted, but that they played an absolutely essential role in deterring and destroying terrorism and carrying out seemingly other good works in Afghanistan?
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and will address it in just one moment. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for many of those who return from Afghanistan and other places around the world, mental health has been an all too familiar issue raised by veterans time and again. And the events of the last few days and weeks will have exacerbated the situation, reopening old wounds, and everybody across this House will have had examples of that. We must improve mental health services for our veterans. Mr. Speaker, in addressing the very point that's just been made, I want to address directly all those who served in Afghanistan and their families, especially the families of those who were lost. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Your sacrifice was not in vain. You brought stability, reduced the terrorist threat, and enabled progress. We are all proud of what you did. Your sacrifice deserves better than this, and so do the Afghan people. Mr. Speaker, there's been a major miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and staggering complacency from our government about the Taliban threat. The result is that the Taliban are now back in control of Afghanistan. The gains made through 20 years of sacrifice hang precariously. Women and girls fear for their liberty. Afghan civilians are holding onto the undercarriage of NATO aircraft, literally clinging to departing hope. And we face new threats to our security and an appalling humanitarian crisis. I will.
Forward, right honourable gentleman, for all the reasons he mentioned, doesn't he agree that President Biden is actually wrong when he talks about American sacrifices in a civil war? The Taliban is not at war with their regime. The Taliban is at war with the civilized values of justice, equality and tolerance that all of us hold dear, and against which it respects no international boundaries.
I would agree with that intervention and thank the honourable member for it. Mr. Speaker, I'll just make some progress and then I will, of course. Mr. Speaker, the desperate situation requires leadership and for the Prime Minister to snap out of his complacency. The most urgent task is the protection of our diplomatic staff still working heroically in Kabul and the evacuation of British nationals and Afghans who've risked their lives. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, the Labour Party fully supports the deployment of troops to this end. We want it to succeed just as quickly and safely as possible. The Defence has said that some people who worked with us will not get back. Unconscionable. The government, in one moment I will, the government must outline a plan to work with our allies to do everything that's possible to ensure that does not happen. Guarantee that our troops have the resources they need to carry out their mission effectively and as safely as possible, and work to provide stable security at the airport in Kabul so that flights can depart and visas can be processed. We all know how difficult that is. We all know how hard everybody is working on the ground, and we fully support it. And I raise an issue not by way of criticism, but just to get some reassurance, because there are reports this morning from NGOs that an evacuation plane left almost empty this morning because evacuees couldn't get to the airport to get to that plane. As I say, we are not challenging the work on the ground. We know how difficult it is, but at some appropriate moment I would like to see that addressed. If true, I will, yes.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I just bring him back to the statement by the President of the United States the other day? Does he not agree with me that this took on the terms really of a sort of shameful excuse? When he blames the Afghan armed forces, who've lost nearly 70,000 in trying to defend Afghan, when corruption had stripped away much of their pay, their money, their support, and the American decision to withdraw the aircraft cover was almost certainly going to lead us. Does he not think that that is shameful?
Former Tory leader Ian Duncan-Smith to Sir Keir Starmer. You're listening to
The US is,
LBC.
of course, an important ally, but to overlook the fighting of the Afghan troops and forces in recent years, they have been at the forefront of that fighting, I think is for any of us to overlook all the situation that they now find themselves in. Mr. Speaker, the urgent task is, of course, the evacuation. Equally urgent is the immediate refugee crisis. I'll just make some progress and then I will. Many Afghans have bravely sought to rebuild their country. They did so on a promise of democratic freedoms, the rule of law, and liberty for the oppressed, including women and girls. They are our friends, and that was our promise. They are now fearing for their lives. We do not turn our backs on friends at their time of need. We owe an obligation to the people of Afghanistan. There should be a resettlement scheme for people to rebuild their lives here. Safe and legal routes. It must be a resettlement scheme that meets the scale of the enormous challenge. But what the government has announced this morning does not do that. It is vague. It will support just 5,000 in the first year, a number without rationale. Was that based on a risk assessment of those most at need, or was it plucked out of the air? Others, the offer to others in one moment, the offer to others is in the long term. But for those desperately needing our help now, there is no long term, Mr. Speaker. Just day-to-day survival. Yet again, this government, I will be doing.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, as well as the need for a much more bold and ambitious resettlement programme. Would he agree with me that this disaster must mark a turning point for our failed asylum system, in particular getting rid of the so-called hostile environment and the Nationality and Borders Bill, under which a woman fleeing the Taliban with her children on a boat across the Channel would be criminalised? Does he agree that that bill must now be revised?
Thank you for that intervention. I'm going to come on to the specifics of the system, because yet again this government seems ill-prepared and unwilling, just as it has been too slow to provide sanctuary to Afghans who served alongside Britain. Too many reports of eligible Afghans facing bureaucratic hurdles and too many unfairly excluded. Mr. Speaker, knowing the data withdrawal was coming for months, the Home Office is not close to completing the process they've already got up and running. It was designed to help 7,000 people, yet Home Office figures this week showed only 2,000 have been helped so far. I will be going.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and the point that I wanted to make indeed to the Prime Minister was the situation facing Afghan Sikhs. Now, I know from my own constituency casework that there are Afghan Sikhs in the system at the moment waiting for clearance from the Home Office. So one of the things I would like to call on the government to do is to process those as quickly as possible and not leave all those people in the system waiting any longer than they have to at the moment. They are terrified of the idea of being sent back home, and despite the reassurance given to my honourable friend, I do not see any movement from the Home Office to give these people the legal status that they need.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and there have been other examples across the House of individuals and groups who are very obviously at risk in Afghanistan and need to come out just as quickly as possible. And that's, Mr. Speaker, where the question arises to what's behind the 5,000 number and why the others are having to wait so long. Mr. Speaker, the scale of the refugee crisis requires an international response, but we must lead it, and lead with a resettlement programme that meets the scale of the challenge. The scheme must be generous and welcoming. If it's not, we know the consequences. We know the consequences now. Violent reprisals in Afghanistan, people tragically fleeing into the arms of human traffickers. We know this is what will happen. More people risking and losing their lives on unsafe journeys, including across the English Channel. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead.
Giving way. He speaks of people fleeing, but what we have yet to assess is whether anyone outside of Kabul is able to get to somewhere of safety. Does he agree that now a safe corridor needs to be opened to an international border so that those who are not near Kabul can also get to safety via third countries?
David Moran for the Dems. So Chris Dyer,
I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that intervention. And there is huge concern, as all members will know, about our line of sight beyond Kabul just at the moment. And again, that calls into question where the 5,000 number comes from, because we're not even in a position to assess at the moment the position outside of Kabul. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. Mr. Speaker,
the government of this kingdom to be overthrown by a wicked and brutal regime, I venture that he would want a leading role in the resistance. He wouldn't be queuing at the airport, would he?
When I was Director of Public, I had some of my prosecutors in Afghanistan at huge risk working against terrorism with other brave souls. I won't take from him or anybody else. Mr. Speaker, these immediate challenges are addressed. We face an uncertain and difficult future. The Taliban are back in control, and we cannot be naive about the consequences. We've lost our primary source of leverage in political discussions, and everything we've achieved in the last 20 years is now under threat. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will give way. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right to say that we cannot allow Afghanistan to become a training ground for violent hate and terrorism. But that will be more difficult now that Afghanistan has descended into chaos. But if preventing Al-Qaeda camps is now the limit of our ambition, we are betraying 20 years of sacrifice by our armed forces, and we're betraying the Afghan people who cannot be left the cruelty of the Taliban. I will.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He speaks about the lack of ambition and the lack of urgency, which of course summarises everything about this government's approach to this crisis and many others. Isn't it telling about the whole approach of this government that when we had an Afghan government that we wanted to support, they should cut the amount of overseas aid we sent, and now the Taliban are in charge, they're talking about increasing the amount of overseas aid?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I'm going to come to the question of aid in just a minute, because it's a very important point in this context, looking at what has happened in recent weeks and months. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will make way. So we have to use every tool that remains at our disposal to protect human rights in Afghanistan. The government is right not to recognise the Taliban as the official government, and the Prime Minister's made that clear. But this must be part of a wider strategy developed with our UN security partners, our NATO allies, to apply pressure to the Taliban, not only to stamp out a resurgence of terror groups, but to retain the liberties and human rights of Afghans. We must work with Afghans' neighbours to ensure there is consistent pressure, and there must be a UN-backed plan to ensure our aid budget is used to support humanitarian causes in Afghanistan, not fund the Taliban. Mr. Speaker, this is a difficult task with no guarantee of success. So it should concern us all that the Prime Minister's judgment on Afghanistan has been appalling. Mr. Speaker, nobody believes that Britain and our allies could have remained in Afghanistan indefinitely, or that Britain could have fought alone. NATO leaders were put in a difficult position after President Trump agreed with the Taliban that all US forces would withdraw by May 2021. But Mr. Speaker, that agreement was made in February 2020, 18 months ago. We've had 18 months to prepare and plan for the consequences of what followed. To plan and to prepare for the resettlement of refugees and those that have supported us, for supporting the Afghan government in managing withdrawal, for securing international and regional pressure on the Taliban and support for the Afghan government. The very problems we're confronting today in this debate were all known problems for the last 18 months and has been a failure of preparation.
Labour leader on LBC, live from the House of Commons, getting into the heart of the decisions of the last 18 months that has led us to this position. You're listening to LBC's special coverage of the debate on Afghanistan in the House of Commons. Back live to Keir.
Matters today. He was in a position to lead, but he didn't. Britain holds a seat at the United Nations Security Council. We're a key player within NATO. We're chair of the G7. Every one of these platforms could and should have been used to prepare for the withdrawal of forces, to rally international support behind a plan to stabilise Afghanistan through the process and keep us safe. I will give way in just a minute. What did Mr. Speaker, did the Prime Minister use those platforms in those 18 months to prepare? No, he didn't. What did he do? What did he do instead? We debated this. He cut the development budget. He cut the development budget that was key to the strength and resilience of democracy in Afghanistan. He's making a great deal today of the money he's putting in. £292 million was spent in Afghanistan in 2019. In 2021, 155 million. Short-sighted, small-minded, and a threat to security. Well, in a moment, I'm going to make this list. He failed to visit Afghanistan.